afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our celebration of the AOI's 150th anniversary. Each segment of today's program pretty much stands alone and speaks for itself, and I know everyone's anxious to dine. You've got your salads and all. Certainly you're welcome to start on those. I want to take a moment to introduce our head table. In addition to our officers, our two distinguished guests who will be providing remarks, our former Mayor Anthony Williams, who is now the CEO of the Federal City Council, and also the Washington Post's own answer man, columnist John Kelly. The officers joining me here today, in addition to our directors, but the officers here at the head table, and please hold your applause, are our Vice President Jan Evans, I know it's hard to do, our Treasurer Hewlett Presley Taylor, our Secretary John Richardson, Nelson Ryman Snyder, our historian, and joining them are John's wife, Joyce, Nelson's wife, Lisa Nickerson, and my wife, Pat, who I want to publicly thank for all the behind-the-scenes help she provides to the AOI. Now, I would like to direct your attention to the screen at the back of the room, or those that have your backs to me, it would be to the front of the room, for a 10-minute history presentation on the Association of the Oldest Inhabitants.
AOI, the Association of Oldest Inhabitants of the District of Columbia. AOI, the Association Founded on December 7, 1865, the AOI is the district's oldest civic organization. Founded on December 7, 31 prominent residents, including two former mayors, met at City Hall, now the Court of Appeals, and pledged to preserve memories and matters of historic interest, to work and strive for the city's stability, security, and advancement, to aid in every way the prosperity and well-being of the district while preserving the heritage of its past. From the minutes of the charter meeting, anxious to cultivate social intercourse and unite ourselves more closely as original settlers of the District of Columbia, we have formed ourselves into an association. The AOI founders sought to preserve the memories, histories, and stories of the nation's capital through reminiscences and oral histories. AOI's Washington Monument Memorial Stone, located at the 240-foot level on the west wall of the 22nd Landing, was dedicated July 4th, 1870. Alexander Roby Shepherd, a native Washingtonian, was the territorial governor of the district from 1873 to 1874. While the members of the AOI were not supporters of Shepherd during his reign, they came to appreciate the improvements he made in the city's infrastructure. After establishing a silver mining operation in Batopilas, Mexico, he died in 1902 and was buried in Rock Creek Cemetery. The AOI proudly participated in his funeral procession as well as in a welcome home parade given in his honor in 1887. In 1909, a statue of Shepherd was erected in front of the district building where it stood until 1972, when the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation had it removed for the redevelopment of Pennsylvania Avenue. AOI member Nicholas Callan's house at 1418 F Street on the left served as the AOI's headquarters for a number of years in the late 1800s. Later, the organization met in the Corcoran Building at 15th and Pennsylvania Avenue for many years prior to moving to the Old Union Firehouse at 19th and H Streets in 1909. It served as AOI's headquarters until 1956. When the AOI welcomed the few remaining members of the Veteran Volunteer Firemen's Association in 1907 in order to preserve their D.C. charter, the AOI became the custodians of not only the old Union Firehouse, but a treasure trove of artifacts and memorabilia, including several pieces of vintage firefighting apparatus and 2 bronze bells. In 1938, the AOI supported the newly designated District of Columbia flag. The D.C. flag, based on the Sulgrave of George Washington, the Washington family coat of arms, flies above most district buildings. In 1956, the AOI moved its headquarters to the Heinrich House after selling the old firehouse at 19th and 8th Street to the International Monetary Fund World Bank. As the AOI's collection of art, historic artifacts, and fire department-related memorabilia grew, it could no longer afford the near $1,000 per month storage fees for the collection, so dispersed it to the Smithsonian, the Historical Society, the Navy Museum, and the Department of Interior. It retained its valuable pieces of fire apparatus and 2 large bronze bells until they were turned over to the Friendship Fire Association Museum in 2015. The AOI relinquished its claim and abandoned its plans to build a new headquarters on M Street in Georgetown in 1972. This architectural rendering of AOI's planned but never built new headquarters building in Georgetown was purchased by the AOI and donated to the Peabody Room for the Georgetown Branch Library. The picture was damaged during the fire of 2007, but the Community Partnership of Georgetown University paid to have it restored. From 1960 to 1980, the AOI's membership declined. Palisades resident Harold Gray almost single-handedly saved the AOI when he and several others revived the organization in the early 1990s. The AOI is known for its well-attended monthly luncheon meetings, many of which were held at the Pier 7 restaurant on the D.C. waterfront until it closed in 2014. AOI averages 90 members and guests per month at the new location here at Capitol Skyline Hotel on I Street Southwest. And on occasion, when hosting former Washington Post columnist Bob Levy or his successor John Kelly, we've welcomed 130 members and guests. In 2006, the AOI presented its first Governor Shepard Award for Public Works Improvements to former D.C. Mayor Tony Williams. The female reenactors of distinction, freed, many of them AOI members, interpret Civil War-era history and have presented at our luncheon meetings, as has Elizabeth Smith Brownstein, performed the music of Abraham Lincoln's era and has joined numerous other AOI members, guests, authors, and researchers to discuss the architectural, social, artistic, and political history of the District of Columbia. But perhaps the AOI is best known for its efforts to return the statue of Governor Shepard to the District Building in January 2005 after the statue's near-quarter-century exile. By January 2009, we arranged for the statue to be lighted in time for President Obama's inauguration and, in 2010, dedicated a biographical plaque at the base of the statue to inform visitors of his accomplishments. In 2012, the statue was cleaned and restored by Artex Corporation with funds provided by the District of Columbia Commission on the Arts and Humanities. With a generous donation from AOI member Edith Johnson, regular maintenance of the statue will be performed for many years to come. One of the AOI's proudest accomplishments was the search for the believed long-lost records of the AOI Colored Incorporated. After a frustrating attempt to find any records of this parallel African-American organization, AOI member James Good serendipitously stumbled upon them while conducting research for a book. William H. Nixon served as president from 1942 to 1962 of what was later abbreviated to the Oldest Inhabitants Incorporated. His records were donated to Howard University's Moreland Spingarn Library by his granddaughter Dolores Munsey at the encouragement of the AOI. AOI members support other important initiatives related to its mission. The Philip W. Ogilvie Award is one of these. Dr. Ogilvie was a past president of the AOI, had served as the first archivist of the district, and as a professor of tourism studies at George Washington University. Given in Phil's name, a $750 scholarship is presented annually to George Washington University's Masters of Tourism Administration Programs valedictorian. Additionally, the AOI supports the Historical Society of Washington, D.C., and its Kiplinger Research Library. The annual D.C. Historical Studies Conference, the Military Road School Preservation Trust, the preservation of the district's Civil War forts, annual Emancipation Day events, exhibits at the John A. Wilson District Building, the Franklin School Coalition, and efforts to design, build, staff, and maintain a new D.C. City Archives facility. We have promoted the initiatives to support the Friends of Clara Barton's Missing Soldiers Office and their partners, the GSA and the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, Maryland. At the encouragement of member Joe Grano, now deceased, the AOI ventured into a successful multi-year effort to retain the district's war memorial as its own and focus attention on Pershing Park as the National World War I Memorial. On more than 18 occasions between 1888 and 2009, the AOI has sought to call attention to and address the disenfranchisement of district residents by their denial of voting representation in Congress. The organization and its membership address many causes that reflect AOI's mission to preserve the L'Enfant and Macmillan plans and the history of the district, its historic organizations, institutions, and its citizens. The all-volunteer board of the AOI of D.C. thanks you for joining us today as we conclude our 150th year and celebrate AOI's Sesquicentennial.
So I guess this begs the question, what are we going to do for the next 150 years? So now, hopefully, everybody knows a little bit about what happened up to 1:16 p.m. on December 5th, 2015. Well, if you're like me, I can't wait to open the Metro section of the Post almost every morning to read the answer man's take on a topic of local interest. John Kelly has served as the district's chronicler for 11 years since succeeding Bob Levy. Bill Gold's The District Line appeared for 33 years, and others, including AOI's own past president, John Claggett Proctor, who filed his stories as Washington and environs for the Washington Sunday Star from 1928 until 1949, all serve as our historic scribes. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to present John Kelly.
Thank you, Bill. I didn't know that AOI didn't support Boss Shepherd at first.
We're big fans back then.
And then you went to his funeral just to make sure he was dead. I was looking through the Washington Post the other day, specifically the February 23rd, 1880 Washington Post. And I went to page 4, which was, I don't think anybody here would have read that issue, even though you are the oldest inhabitant. But it was full of classified ads presented in the style of advertising at the time. So there were really no photographs in the ads, and the type was fairly simple. But most of the ads had one of those drawings and engraving, the sort of pointing finger pointing at the ad as if that was going to make you do whatever the ad said. And here's what was going on in Washington in February 1880. The local committee of the Irish Relief Association was meeting at Shays Association Hall at 6th and Pennsylvania Northwest. The National Democratic Committee was meeting at Willard's Hotel for the purpose of fixing the time and place for holding the next Democratic National Convention. They picked Cincinnati, in case you were wondering. The Missionary Conference of the Protestant Episcopal Church was meeting, discussing things such as Indian missions and the Mexican branch of the church. J.N. Minix of Uniontown, D.C., took out a notice which read, "I hereby forewarn all persons from crediting anyone in my name, as I will be paying any debts, crediting anyone in my name, as I will pay any debts in person." You see these ads now in the Post. So I was curious about J.N. Minix, and it turned out he was a carriage maker who had run his business in Uniontown. We pretty much know it as Anacostia now. Since he'd been running it since 1844. He built carriages, surreys, phaetons, and buggies, but he was known best for his grocer's wagons. Johnson Brothers advertised that day for their coal business, saying they had the largest and best selected stock of coal and wood in the district. They had 4 locations around the city. The main office was at 12th and F Southwest, so not far from where you used to meet. And they boasted in their ad that they kept these locations in contact with one another by telephone.
Wow.
They must have been one of the earliest businesses to have a telephone in D.C. Columbia bicycles were being sold at 1108 E Street Northwest, near where there's a, not for much longer, unfortunately, a Barnes & Noble right now. That was also the location of the Columbia Bicycle School. And back then, when you bought a bicycle, you needed to be taught how to ride it. And so they had instructors, and if it was like every other bicycle school in the country, you often wore a harness, and an instructor would run alongside you, holding on to you. The National Theater advertised a play called The Tourists in a Pullman Palace Car. Sounds interesting. Ford's Theater was presenting An Arabian Night, featuring Harun al-Rashid and his mother-in-law. I think mother-in-laws are always funny. J. Levy, the cornet virtuoso of the world, was at Lincoln Hall. Mrs. Adeline Duval of New York was advertising elocution lessons for 50 cents. The Washington Light Infantry Corps was holding a fundraiser for most of the month at the Masonic Temple, a grand military fair. Tickets were 25 cents for a gentleman and lady, 10 cents for a lady on her own. And of course, there were plenty of ads for medicines to treat catarrh, asthma, consumption, bronchitis, and deafness. And that was just one medicine. Dr. M.W. Case's carbolate of tar inhalant. Dr. White of 1416 Pennsylvania Avenue, opposite Willard's Hotel, offered his services. He was a foot surgeon, treating corns, bunions, diseased nails, chilblains, and vascular excrescences. He said he was patronized by the elite of the world. The Democratic National Committee was meeting right across the street at Willard's Hotel, so maybe they all came over to get their excrescences removed. A retailer named Julius Landsberg had not yet expanded beyond carpets and window shades. His ad for his store at 421 7th Street said he had in stock 5,000 pieces of tapestry, 3,000 pieces of extra super and 3-plies, 2,000 cotton chains, and hemp. Hemp is legal in Washington now. There was an ad for an opening of a new store at the 705 Market Space the Boston Dry Goods House with a full line of black silks, satin de Lyon, French novelties, housekeeping linens, bleaches, sheetings, and muslins, laces, hosiery, gloves, ladies' cotton underwear, men's furnishing goods, etc., 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 etc. He only needed one etc., but he had 5. Goods freely shown, no one importuned to purchase, and that was new. It used to be you'd go to a counter and ask to see this, this, and this, and he was trying something new. And of course, we know what the Boston Dry Goods House became, because at the bottom listed was Woodward, Lothrop, and Cochrane. I don't know whatever happened to Cochrane, but Woodward and Lothrop stuck around for a while. Just underneath that ad was one for the Corcoran Gallery of Art, announcing that it would be open from 10 to 4 that day, admission free. Woody's may be gone, and Landsberg, and Columbia Bicycles, and Dr. Case's Carbolate of Tar inhalant, thankfully. But some things remain, though in a transformed way. I was at the Corcoran Gallery of Art the other day, or at least the building that was at that time the Corcoran Gallery of Art, what we now know as the Renwick. The Corcoran has been absorbed into the National Gallery of Art and George Washington University. The place where these ads appeared, the Washington Post, I'm glad to say, is still around. It's not as old as AOI. It was founded in 1877. And it's on the move, moving from 15th and L to Franklin Square. It's already started moving. My office moves next week. There was one other ad on that page that I wanted to note, and the headline was Celebration of Washington's Birthday. And it read, the Association of Oldest Inhabitants will meet on the 23rd at Talmadge Hall at 12:30 p.m. to celebrate the day as usual by reading a portion of Washington's farewell address and the delivery of an oration by the members of the society. The public are respectfully invited to attend. AOI, I did a little search to see how many times AOI was mentioned since 1877, between 1877 and about 1987, which is when the Post on ProQuest moves to LexisNexis, and so you really don't have things after that in ProQuest. And it was 930 times AOI was mentioned in roughly 110 years. So let us now fast forward, which people in 1880 wouldn't have known what you meant by that. Fast forward, walk quickly forward. Not all the way to today, but to 1841, we saw a picture of the old firehouse that AOI used to meet at, and it was the annual meeting of AOI to mark the new year. So it was January 1st, 1841. 1941, I'm sorry, yes, 1941 at the old firehouse. And they mentioned that the oldest member of AOI who was there was 98 years old, and his name was Christian Heinrich. And they marked the new year the way you did every year, although I guess you don't do this anymore until today. We're going to resurrect it by ringing the massive firehouse bell in the building. And I asked Bill if he had brought the bell, and apparently he didn't, but luckily I brought a bell because I was afraid you might not have brought it. And this bell actually was a gift from an English friend of mine. It was made at the Whitechapel Bell Foundry, which has been around for 400 years in London, and made the bells in the old post office tower. And just going to grab my knife here so I can ring it. But what they did in 1941 is ring the bell, and they rang it 15 times. Why would they ring it 15 times? It was almost 100 years old at that point, 80 years old. Because if you add 1, 9, 4, and 1 together, you get 15. So it's 2015. How many is that? 2, 7, 8? So 8. So let's ring it 8 times. All right. So happy birthday, AOI. Thank you for inviting me to be part of it. And Here's to another 150, and please keep reading the Washington Post.
Thank you, John. So the bells are now in the care of the Friendship Fire Association Museum. So Walter, you, and Mark, and Jim, you'll have to ring the bells. Well, we're about to serve our lunch, okay? But I just wanted to take a moment before we do so for all of us to keep in mind the victims of violence around the world, and also of our past members and friends, many of whom we don't know, 150 years worth, but most recently, our past director, Sherwood Smith, Austin Kiplinger, who I know would have loved to have been here today, and our past board member, Cindy Yonke. So please keep them in your thoughts, enjoy your lunch, and the program will resume when we get the sense that everyone's sort of finishing up, okay? Thank you. Enjoy your lunch, everybody. Bell, courtesy, John Kelly. Well, listen, Best Laid Plans, as the producer of this, I had a little bit tighter schedule in mind, but I realize everyone's having a good time. You know, the meals came out not quite as quickly and all as I had planned on my schedule, but if you are a regular attendee of our AOI luncheons, you know that we eat and enjoy our lunches while we conduct the business portion of our meeting and listen to our guest speaker. So rather than try to sequence this all so it's just, one thing after another, we're going to continue on and ask people, I know some people have just now been served, to please and continue to enjoy your lunch. And I want to take the opportunity to for some thank yous and for some acknowledgments. First, I hope everybody's enjoying their lunch. I'd like to thank the staff at the Capitol Skyline Hotel for working closely with, for over a year. We've been working with General Manager Jeff Raganese and Director of Associate and Corporate Accounts Chris Benner, who's been here all day, and John Schumacher, who's the Executive Chef, who's prepared and recommended these meals and prepared them today. The music for the reception today was provided by Relitza Pacheva. She's with Levine Music. Now, Levine Music is a division of the Levine School of Music, and you think, well, they get their students out to do programs. Well, I guess they don't believe in child labor or something. It's faculty performers. So if anybody needs music for any of their events, contact, Levine Music. Just Google it and all, because they've been great to work with, and they can do everything from, simple keyboard to string ensembles to brass ensembles to whatever. So, we're really glad to have found them. The table designs and all today, I want to extend my appreciation to Jessica Hodge and Maggie Hobbs, our directors, as well as Barbara Ionis and Juliet Smith, who have worked to get our tables arranged the way they are. And our appreciation goes to Johnson's Florists for partially underwriting the cost of our centerpieces, which I think turned out very nicely. And I want to thank everybody, the board, that helped make this event possible. We have other acknowledgments on the back cover of your programs, and one place where we fell a little short, and this is on me, is we didn't have enough programs to go around. So I'm sorry that some of you have to share, but when I get home, I will put a copy of the program up on our website so you all can get it, or I can email you one. So I apologize for that. I sincerely apologize if I overlooked anybody else, but everyone has our unconditional appreciation. In 2000, at one of my first AOI luncheons that I presided over, our guest speaker was Dr. Mark Weiss, who had written a book on the resurgence of the District of Columbia. Dr. Weiss's study provided the blueprint and inspiration for the steps the Financial Control Board would eventually take to help transform the district back into the great city it had once been. In 2006, as the city was undergoing its transformation, the AOI presented Mayor Tony Williams with our first Governor Shepard Award for Civic Improvement in recognition for the improvements the mayor had begun, which we considered to be in the spirit of Governor Shepard, who sought to accomplish many of those same goals back in the 1870s. After leaving office in 2007, Mayor Williams became the CEO of the Federal City Council, an organization among whose goals include many of the same economic and quality of life improvements all district residents aspire to for our city. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to present Mayor Tony Williams.
So I'm going to be speaking while you eat, so you can pretend you're on a flight or something, watching a movie while you eat. I'll periodically go bing, bing, and seatbelt sign. I got to say, I'm really honored that you would have me speak, not just speak. Even before I say that, I'm really honored that you call me Mayor Williams, because the correct title, for all of you who are connoisseurs of history and protocol, I mean, it really is Mayor. No one says, hey, there's ex-Colonel Sanders. He's always Colonel Sanders, right? So, you're mayor. It's not ex-Councilman Schwartz, it's Councilman Schwartz. So now we got our grammar in order. You know, history's always been important to me, and certainly history lives with me. And I'm going to keep my remarks short, because one moment in history that lives with me to this day, talk about uses and misuses of history, is when I was in the 8th grade at Holy Name Church, which was in Holy Name School, which was Holy Name in LA, was one of the first African-American, not the first African-American Catholic church in LA. And under her plenary authorities, the Mother Superior, Sister Carolyn Mary, decided without an election that I would be the class leader of the 8th grade, which is great as far as I'm concerned, but not as far as, I guess, my former classmates were concerned. They didn't like it. So not only did she anoint me the class leader, but she said that I was going to speak at this lunch of the 8th grade. And to my everlasting horror, as I started giving my acceptance speech, a lot of my classmates got up and walked out. So I'm forever horrified at people getting up and leaving. Although, you know, my speaking ability has come in handy, because I'm looking at Carol there. Because at the council, we used to have these, they're now on TV, which I can't imagine. But we had these regular mayor-council breakfasts. And I knew that whenever the council was particularly angry, because everybody, you know, the council, they would all like to showcase. Everybody's no offense, Carol. Everybody's a star in their own movie, and they'd all say, Mayor, what about, you know, this, the city's going to hell, and what about this? And I found this, and I'd always say, I'll get back to you. But, you know, 13 people yelling at you after a while, you know, I felt like I'd rather go and get a root canal than go to this mayor-council breakfast. So I decided after a while, I figured out the answer was, at the beginning of the mayor-council breakfast, if I gave about 20 minutes of remarks, it would put everybody asleep, and we'd have a beautiful breakfast. So you should be aware of that. But speaking of mayor-council, you know, you were talking about the control board and the leadership role they played, and undeniably, the control board played a leadership role in the recovery of the District of Columbia. And I'll take my little share of credit, but I always say that a big part of the partnership that brought the city back was Linda Kropp, who was chair of the council. And I'll give you one data point to think about. You know, Ned Gandhi, who I appointed as CFO, did a fabulous job for us as CFO. Will say, well, under my role as CFO, we had a X number of consecutive balanced budgets, which is true. But it's also true that neither the mayor, and for my purposes here, nor the council ever submitted or contemplated an unbalanced budget. This was real leadership on the council's part. Another thing about Carol, I'll say, as part of this council is, you know, there were, back in the day, in the halcyon days, for all of us who love history, there was actually a really good Republican Party. If you think about it, but think, I'll give you the environment. Last year, Russell Train died. A lot of people know Russell Train. Russell Train was one of the fathers of environmental legislation and the environmental movement in the United States. Solid Republican, very, very important point. Environment. If we talk about international relations, a long series of Republicans leading the way in an enlightened international view of the role of the United States, Republican Party. More Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Bill. The Civil Rights Bill would not have been passed but for the leadership of an Ohio representative to get the Civil Rights Bill out of the Rules Committee. More Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Bill than Democrats. These are Republicans, the best Republican Party, represented by Carol Schwartz. So Carol, we love you. Give her a big hand. You know, I think that a lot of what I was able to do as mayor really was shaped by a love of history, because history is one of my favorite topics. I, to this day, really try to honor history in how I think about things, how I do things. Give you an example, when I left office to honor Boss Shepard, and I'm really happy to have received the first Eugene Boss Shepard Award. When I left office, I thought it would be fitting and appropriate for my wife and I to go down to Argentina because it just sounded exotic, like Boss Shepard went to Mexico, I'll go to Argentina. You know, I'm in exile in Argentina, I'm waiting for my call back, I haven't gotten the call yet. But, you know, so history's always been important to me. A couple examples. One example where I grew up in LA, I really saw the example of the police power of government. We often talk about the police power of government. We try to limit that power. We try to ascribe rights to individuals to inhibit and constrain that power. But at bottom, government has enormous power. This I realized at a young age when I was growing up in LA, and this was about 1963, and I rode up on my bike. We grew up in the oldest part of LA, in this old neighborhood, the West Adams neighborhood. Anybody watch that series 6 Feet Under?
Oh, yeah. About the morticians?
Yeah, about the morticians. Their house was in our neighborhood. It's an old part of LA. I ride up on my bicycle. Now, I was a kid. I thought this was great. They had decided to build the I-10 Santa Monica Freeway and obliterated this neighborhood. Then later that summer, my family and I, we were traveling around the country, and I'll never forget. We were in St. Paul, Minnesota. There's another famous African-American neighborhood in St. Paul, Minnesota, where they decided to build I-94, obliterated the neighborhood. So you really see the abuses of this enormous power government has when it's left in the wrong hands or when it's not properly constrained. But you also see the beauty of history. I remember growing up, and this has lived with me to this day, that we went up to this, outside of LA, there are these mountains called the San Gabriel Mountains. And in the San Gabriel Mountains, this is apropos for the 100th anniversary of Einstein. And outside of LA, there are San Gabriel Mountains. And on the San Gabriel Mountains, my dad would always take us up to Mount Wilson, where there's a surpassingly beautiful view of the LA basin. You realize why millions of people moved to California. And my dad was telling me that Edwin Hubble, who was the famous astrophysicist and developed the Big Bang, developed it at Mount Wilson. Einstein spent a lot of time at Caltech. And my dad was telling me that, when you look at this, think about this. When you look at the stars, right, you're looking at the present, but you're really looking at history, right? So that everything you do, you really have got to be looking at history and the role that history plays in shaping how we make decisions, how we think about what we do, who we are, is all very, very important. So if you're a city and you are the oldest inhabitants, think about the role history has played in shaping cities in general in a city like Washington, D.C. If you take a city, I was just in London doing some work with the London School of Economics, a city 10 times older than Washington, D.C., if you give or take a couple hundred years. So 2,000 years old, a long time. National governments have changed. Intermediate levels of governments have changed. Our whole economic way of ordering society has changed, but the city's still there. Washington, D.C., we've gone through the Revolutionary War, we got burned down, the Civil War, the fight for civil rights, emancipation, the great exodus from the city, and now the return to the city, and the city's still here, and the oldest inhabitants are still here, and I'm pleased to say you're still in the fight, so it's all very important. Understanding history. History for me, understanding history for me and shaping my view as a mayor, a couple of things come to mind. One is, when you're in a city, it's very, very important that you combine two things. You combine the ideal and the real. You combine the intangible, the ethereal, the inspirational with the concrete and the real. It's very important to think about it. So a city is two things. It's a matter of aspiration. You think of the Statue of Liberty, millions of people are moving to the city to fulfill a vision. Carol knows this. If you're talking to your people in the city, you're talking to them, if you're lucky, hopefully about a noble vision for your city. So there is a city of the vision. There's also the city of the practical and the real. Another example would be if you're flying into Washington, D.C., there's one view of the city. If you're flying in at night and you're coming down the Potomac River, this breathtakingly beautiful city, that's the city of vision and the city of ambition. And then if you drive over to Chesapeake, over on Ward 8, and you look at neighborhoods in Ward 8, you're looking at the real concrete city, right? This is a city that you're dealing with. So a couple of things come to mind. One is you've got to understand what you can do, what you can't do, what's important to do, and what it's really worthwhile putting aside. I would argue to you in a city, especially like Washington, D.C., if you take historic preservation and this notion of historic preservation, the role of the city in siting and place and identity, I think we have to be very, very careful if we think about how we name places and how we think about places, because tastes change. Our views change, and we have to keep that in mind. I'm not taking one position or another, but I think we have to keep this in mind. For me, personally, I was in London, I walked by the Church of St. Clement Dane, which happens to be the host church or the mother church of the Royal Air Force. And out in front of the church, there's a head of the fighter command, and there's General Field Air Marshal Robert Harris, so-called Mad Bomber Harris, who was in charge of the bomber command. So now you could ask yourself, we can all think about, well, was it morally justified for the Royal Air Force? This is before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for the Royal Air Force and later all the Allied Air Force to essentially flatten one after another German city. In World War II, we all thought universally this was a great idea. Now we have different views on it. I happen to think it was still morally justified. But the point is, we all have different views. So now let's bring the tape forward. I mean, if you ask me, is it, thinking about history, are we in our rights to say that the Confederate flag ought to be taken down from all public buildings? I think it ought to be taken down from every public building. Why? Not only because it represents slavery, not only because to me it represents racial subjugation, but we were talking about this at our table. I think not enough is made of the fact, and Senator Moynihan used to talk about this, the Confederate flag is a flag of sedition and rebellion against the United States. How can you allow this flag to stand? We wouldn't allow you to fly any other flag about rebelling against the United States. We shouldn't allow you to fly the Confederate flag. So to me, that's kind of an easier argument. But then when you move over the spectrum and you start talking about renaming places, the problem I have is what standard are we going to use to rename places and buildings? Are we going to use contemporary standards or standards at the time? It's a very, very difficult question. All I can say is, it's easy for me to say now because I'm out of office, so people don't like what I'm saying, it doesn't really matter. But if you look at what happened, we all marvel at all the success in China because of Deng Xiaoping. But look at the horrors of the Cultural Revolution. Look at Stalin and rewriting history, the horrors of Hitler and bad art and rewriting history. I'm not saying that what we're doing is anything near that, but I think we ought to be very, very careful about kind of universally reordering history with all its warts, with all of its problems, and take that energy we'd be using to kind of, in my mind, reorder history and apply that energy to better purpose, because there are some real needs, there are some real purposes for which it ought to be applied. But just a thought, an observation on my part, and indeed, when I talk about using history, I'll give you another data point, and I'll wrap up with this. I think, we're coming up on we finished the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, reading a lot of histories about Washington, D.C., and histories about the Civil War. I have to say, because I'm before this audience, my famous quotation of the Civil War is that book that Gene Edward Smith wrote about Ulysses S. Grant, and I'm happy that he's enjoying a revision now in his fortunes because he was a better president than we give him credit for. Gene Edward Smith would say a lot of the reason why Grant was basically dismissed was because it was kind of post-Civil War Southern restoration of history. So we kind of dissed Grant and called him a butcher and an idiot and a drunk. But speaking of a drunk, Bill Sherman had a great quotation. He said, Ulysses S. Grant was a great man. I supported him, he was drunk, and he supported me when I was crazy. So I think that's a great quotation. But we're coming up after the Civil War, though, on the now the 150th anniversary of Reconstruction. So as an African American, I look back on Reconstruction and look back on the Civil Rights Acts that were written around the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments that were written after the Civil War, and you look and you say, now, what was the problem? I think they had all the laws on the books, they had the constitutional provisions on the books. How could we have been so wrong, this country, to continue this subjugation all the way through, up until, depending on how you look at it, to the present day in some way, shape or form? So I would like to think that now that Washington, D.C. is in the competition, it's respected as a city, that we use this moment of inflection to answer a couple of really important questions for our city. And I'll just give you a couple of them in my mind. You know, one, and very, very importantly to many of you, I would say keeping up the fight for full voting representation, right, self-determination for the District of Columbia. I think in a grand sweep of history in my mind, I think that the district has been denied voting rights for a couple reasons. It's been denied voting rights over time because a lot of the Southern restoration in Washington, D.C. was seen as an African-American city. I believe that was an issue. I also believe another reason why we were basically dismissed as due our full voting rights is because we were a city, and cities, right up until fairly recently, were still seen as, you know, there was a notion of there's pure economic logic and the way things ought to be run, and then there's a logic of a city which is about pathology and bad things and a lot of people asking for entitlements, and that's not really America. I mean, I believe it, you know. Americans had this notion of the good America, and cities weren't considered part of the good America, and I think that hurt us. And lastly, I think what continues to hurt us, I think these first two things are beginning to fade, but the thing that still hurts us is the fact that we're, because of the way demographics are working and things are working, we're seen as a democratic city, and I think that's really hurting our fight for voting rights. But I happen to think more positively about this. I think that the forces against voting rights in general, the forces that are keeping, in my humble opinion, the U.S. Congress kind of construed in an unnatural way. In other words, if you really organize voting districts in the United States the way they ought to be organized on a rational basis, you would have basically a center to center-right Congress, not a hard-right Republican Congress. We might have a hard-right Republican Congress is because you have many districts that are gerrymandered. They're gerrymandered because people are trying to basically fight a holding action against demographic changes in the United States. Long and short of it, without continuing to blab, is I think the long-term trend is going in our direction of getting self-determination for Washington, D.C. And it's very important, if we want this self-determination, I think one of the things we ought to be doing as a city is we really ought to be organizing with, it's probably, I don't know the number, but I'm going to sound authoritative and pretend I know. It's 6 states, maybe it's 7 states that are critical states where the districting in these states is going to determine the shape of districting of the House seats, which is going to determine the shape of the Congress. So it's very, very important, if you care about these things, to get engaged with that. Second thing, very, very important for our city is really looking now. You know, there was a time before I came along, and Carol, folks, where the district really wasn't even in the competition. You know, if the competition were the Olympics and we're in a stadium, we weren't even in the arena. We were somewhere in another, we were at a nightclub something. Right? We weren't there in the arena. Now the district is in the arena. We're competing. We're respected with other cities. What's the #1 goal for cities around the world, not just in the United States and certainly for Washington, D.C.? Financial Times did a great study. You know, they have the big read in the Financial Times, and one of them I thought was very, very good about 3-4 years ago. It was essentially, they were saying that after every recession now for the last 4 or 5 decades, really since the Depression, if you look at all these recessions, the recovery from each recession in terms of the speed of the recovery, the breadth of the recovery, the quality of jobs created by the recovery has actually been less and less. And when you overlay that, financial recessions, which are even worse, it's even more telling. And their point is that it's really important if we're going to move forward and really restore real growth to the economy and really good job growth to the economy, that we focus on ways to create more and more small businesses, which create the most jobs and actually do the best to really grow the economy. Now, why do I say that's important for Washington, D.C.? Because where are most small businesses grown? Most small businesses are grown now in cities. Why do I say this? Because by 2050, 70% of the world's population is going to basically live in a city. So what we're seeing in Washington, D.C., you know, we'd like to toot our own horn and that we've brought people back to Washington, D.C., and we're the only city in the world. No, people are coming back to cities around the country. They may be coming back here a little faster. They're coming back to cities around the country. But what I'm saying is that the old way we tried to address this problem is our notion was, let's bring in more investments, whatever the type of investment, whatever the category of the investment, let's bring more investment to the city. This investment to the city is going to expand the coffers of the city, and then we'll be able to invest, the government that is, in job creation, job training, the types of investments that provide for social inclusion, address inequality, build affordable housing. I think we need to continue to do that, but we need to think of ways that really, one, invest in the informal economy of a city. And what do I mean by informal economy of a city? Well, I talked about the inspirational city and the tangible city. Another way you could think about cities to try and how they work over time is there's a global city and there's a local city. The global city is I can be in any city in the world, and I really don't know what city I'm in because it's all global and it's all international standards. The local city is there's certain parts of different cities where I can only be in that city. And a lot of writers and researchers are saying there's certain economies, there's certain enterprises, there's certain energy by real people in real cities around the world that's only indigenous in that city. So the real key in my mind to really expanding the economy in cities, in a city like Washington, D.C., and I haven't figured this out, be open to your suggestions, is how do we invest directly in people and activities that provide this business growth and provide this jobs and provide this sense of self-reliance. That's what we're really talking about, and I think it's so important. Then the last point, and this is my final point, I think, and again, on this moment of inflection is, you know, if you look at Washington, D.C., we were the center of economic growth in the region, and then as the city declined, all the economic growth in the region gained despite Washington, D.C. Now, Washington, D.C. is ascended again. People are moving back to the city. Washington, D.C.'s percentage of the economy is now beginning to change for the positive. Now I would argue, like Eric Foner would say, the greatest story about Reconstruction, now is a moment of inflection for us to think about how can we have an effective conversation with the surrounding states, with the surrounding suburbs on some of our joint needs and responsibilities. Maybe they're transportation, maybe it's healthcare, maybe it's affordable housing. What kind of constructive conversations can we have now? Because think about it. I'll give you an example of St. Louis. At its heyday, St. Louis, 800,000 in population, beginning of around the time of the World's Fair in 1904, if all the surrounding hinterlands had come to the mothership, the great St. Louis, and asked to be part of the city, go away and come back tomorrow like the Wizard of Oz. We don't want you in our imperial city. And then go forward 60 years. St. Louis is begging the suburbs to share in some responsibilities, and St. Louis is a beggar at the table. Nobody wants to talk to St. Louis. What I'm saying is now that we're achieving a parity, right, there's a need for us to talk with one another. What should that conversation be? Can we really put some points on the board in some of these major issues? I'll give you a key one, transportation. remains to be seen, but I would hope that we're able to do that. You know, my time in office, I think for the better, was shaped by this abiding belief, and that is, you know, understanding history, growing up with history, and loving history. You know, I had this little conceit that I'll share with you that I didn't tell people because they would think I was, in fact, conceited. I'm not. But I'm not stupid. I know I'm mayor of the capital of the world. That's a big deal, you know? And the way I looked at it was, and I used to tell my staff this. I said, okay, the way I look at it is we have 1800, we have Pierre l'Enfant, right? And that's his plan. Then 1900, we had all the folks around the plan for the park plan, as Senator McMillan called it.
McMillan Senate plan.
The McMillan Senate plan. So I'm saying, duh, I'm mayor in 2000. Let's rally the city together around a new plan. The first, maybe if you made this a football game, I'm mangling metaphors. If you made this a football game, maybe we've gone through the first quarter of this new stage in our history. We're back in the fight. We're back in the arena. We're respected as a city. But now the heavy lifting and the real questions have to be answered. And I hope we'll be able to look back at history, look back in time, as we did on that mountain, and it'll inspire us to continue to move forward because the challenges remain, the cause endures, but like the AOI, we're going to stay in the fight. So thank you all very much.
Well, thank you very much, Tony. Not former Mayor Williams. We'd like to present you with a certificate of appreciation on the occasion of our 150th anniversary. And thank you for sticking by us. Thank you. Let's say it here. And John Kelly, could I ask you to come up a second?
You need my bell?
No bell. We'd like to present you a certificate of appreciation for being with us today. Okay. And while you all are both here, Nelson, do you have a little gift bag for each, right? Now Nelson's gifts always have like a message with them or something. So,
Thank you.
So
Are you going to give us the message?
these are unique gifts from Nelson's collection of DC history and this striving for representation, right?
I'm hoping these are the first two people that will have read it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, now, just a real quick little departure. Teresa Saxton, who's the treasurer of the Military Road School Preservation Trust, asked if she could come up 1 second.
Thank you. 1 second is right. Thank you.
Go, girl.
I wanted to just say that we first became acquainted with ARI through Dr. Philip Ogilvie, who was a tremendous resource person and supporter. And AOI picked that support for us, and we've been together ever since. And so on this occasion, we celebrated the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Military Road School last year. And on this occasion, we just wanted to recognize AOI. And the few board members we have that are left, could you just stand while I just read this briefly? In tribute and recognition of the association's abiding pursuits to maintain and promote local historic and cultural treasures, as well as to preserve and share significant reminiscences of the past with succeeding generations. On behalf of the Board of Directors and members of the Trust, thank you for your dedication to perpetuate its history, the history of the District of Columbia and its citizenry. So we thank you for what you're doing, and also, Patricia had to leave, but she left this certificate of appreciation from the freed ladies of the African American Civil War Museum. Thank you so much.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, our organization has strived to protect the icons that bring to mind our capital city, such as the historic L'Enfant Street Plan, AOI's Memorial Stone and the Washington Monument, the award-winning DC flag, the District of Columbia War Memorials, the Height of Buildings Act, and returning the Shepherd statue, among our most notable. Though not considered a philanthropic organization, over the years, the AOI has used its well-managed financial resources to support capital improvements to the historic Hyrick House, both when the Historical Society was there and when it served as AOI's headquarters, supported historic conferences and lectures, support the academic programs of George Washington University's Master of Tourism Administration program through our Phil Ogilvie Award, support the programs, exhibits, and operations of the Kiplinger Research Library at the Historical Society, support initiatives which tell the stories of and the effects of the Civil War on Washington, to include the Military Road School Preservation Trust, the United States Colored Troop Cadet Program, and efforts to preserve and promote the Civil War Circle Fort Parks. Our officers, board of directors, and membership, in support of our heritage partners, want to pay forward some financial support to these organizations in concert with our sesquicentennial. Hence, we are about to present our Sesquicentennial Awards.
The AOI is pleased to present its first Sesquicentennial Award to the Military School Preservation Trust in the amount of $25,000.
The AOI is pleased to present one of its Sesquicentennial Awards to the Friendship Fire Association, DC Fire, and EMS, Emergency Medical Services Museum, in the amount of $25,000.
From Hyrick House in the amount of $25,000. Would like to present to the organization the check in the amount of $25,000.
The AOI is pleased to present one of the Sesquicentennial Awards to the Committee of 100's L'Enfant Trust in the amount of $25,000.
The AOI is pleased to present its final Sesquicentennial Award to GW's Masters of Tourism Administration program for the continuation of the Philip Ogilvie Award in the amount of $25,000.
I can tell from the response of our awardees and the reaction from you all that the selection of these recipients by your board was most welcome. I hope everyone noticed the connection between our 150th anniversary and the awards of $25,000 each to 6 organizations for a total of $150,000. As we conclude today's celebration, and perhaps when you take the time to read carefully Zach Klitzman's history of the AOI, which is in your program, I hope you'll take a few minutes to reflect back on the past 150 years. Most of us have only witnessed, 1 to 2/3 of that period of time. But think of all the accomplishments that have transpired over those 150 years. Think of the ebbs and flows of our beautiful District of Columbia over the past 215 years. Think of all the residents, business owners and operators, workers, scholars, documentarians, and historians who have contributed to or documented our city's history. Think, too, about what the next 50 years may bring, or the next 100, or for that matter, the next 150, and continue to be both concerned and or annoyed at the fact that despite what was written into the Constitution about the role and governance of the District of Columbia, for those of us who remain residents, we continue to be denied a voice in the governance of our national government. Not a sermon, just a thought. Just a thought. Okay, now, by the way, at each table, on one chair is a red dot. And the holder or sitter uponner of that red dot gets our centerpiece to take home with him. Anthony asked that all the award recipients gather so he can get closer up shots. I want to thank everyone who came today and everybody who helped make this event possible. Thank you very much for